I'm third generation Pinay from Stockton. My grandparents and parents were farm workers. And they worked hard so that I could be here today and so that I can continue to talk about and work for a better day for workers, period. All right. So we have the book outside. We're selling it for $27, and the proceeds go half to Little Manila and the other half will benefit Delano Farms. So, I'm going to start with a quote. A reporter came to Delano in 1965, Delano, and asked a Filipino what was happening. He said, "For more than 30 years, I have been in strikes in the fields. I think we are going to win this one. But whether or not we win, the growers will know they have been in one hell of a fight." So I want you to think about a couple of things that Ismano said. That he linked his action in Delano with activism that was 30 years prior to that moment. And so oftentimes we think of the Delano Grape Strike as this pivotal moment, but of course it's as historians and activists, hindsight is 2020. At that moment on September 7th, these men are going on strike because they had been for 30 to 40 years. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to be telling my brother Herb back there when to go. All right, go ahead. The first Filipino unions and strikes happened in the sugar plantations of Hawaii. And HSPA goes to the Philippines. They want to recruit illiterate men because they think that they won't end up organizing unions. I'm glad that many of you laughed. The irony of American empire is that Americans taught Filipinos how to be just like them. And in America, there were a lot of labor unions. And Filipinos learned from that. In 1924, one of the biggest strikes that ever hit Hawaii was led by this man, Pablo Manlapit. Next. Pablo Manlapit, I'm not going to give you many details of the strike. I'm going to go very quickly. I only have a few minutes. This is a strike that went all across Hawaii. And Filipinos militantly walk off of the sugar plantations, and in Kauai, next, these leaders, in Hanapepe, they're massacred. 17 of them are shot by local police. Go ahead. The strike was unsuccessful, and the leaders of the strike are blacklisted from working in the plantations in Hawaii. And so by the mid-1920s, thousands of Filipinos are leaving Hawaii and going to the mainland because they've heard about work that they could find in the Central Valley, in Stockton, all the way down here to Delano to the Imperial Valley. And so, quickly, this is the migration, right? We have Filipinos working in the summers in Alaska, and then when they come back to the mainland, they're working in grapes in the Imperial Valley and in Coachella, and then they prune in November and December, and then they have some time off, and then they start an asparagus in the springtime in Stockton. And of course in Stockton, Assemblymember Rob Bonta talked about this poster that's hanging in his wall, right? Extreme racism and white supremacy is meeting these Filipinos everywhere they go across the West Coast. By the 1920s and 1930s, Filipinos on the West Coast are organizing unions, sometimes with Mexicans, sometimes with just Filipinos. There are 10 major strikes that happened from the mid-1920s up until the early 1930s. Many of them are organized by communist organizers in a cannery and agricultural industrial union. So these are workers in asparagus in Stockton. Go ahead. One of the most militant unions that came out of Filipino labor organizing was the Cannery Workers and Farm Laborers Union established in Seattle in 1933. Many of the leaders of farm labor came out of this union, people like Chris Mansalvas, Ernesto Mangalong, Carlos Bulosan. Larry Itliong was a member of this union, and he was its vice president in 1953, and he was its dispatcher in 1957. These are the founders of the union, and the cannery owners were so intimidated of this militant Filipino union that they hired goons to shoot two of their founders in 1933, and two of them are here. Virgil de Yungan was one of them who was assassinated. And this is a flyer produced by that union. 1934 saw organizing in the lettuce fields of Salinas. Crispin Salvas was an organizer here in these lettuce fields. Larry Ilion was an organizer. One of the most militant strikes in California agricultural history happened in 1934 amongst the lettuce workers in Salinas. And I think in John Armington's film, he points out the Teamsters had organized the packing shed workers. Am I correct? All right. The Teamsters had organized the packing shed workers, but not the lettuce cutters. So that strike failed. But Crispin Salvas would go on to lead the cannery workers union. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with this, but basically, by the 1940s, it was called Local 7 Yucapaga. By the 1940s, it was one of the most militant unions in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Now, in the late 1930s, at the same time that the Alaskan Salmon Cannery Workers organizers were organizing workers, Filipinos in Stockton were organizing the Filipino Agricultural Laborers Association. In 1939, they called a massive strike of asparagus workers on Good Friday. Now, Easter Sunday is the biggest day for the industry. So to call a strike at the height of the season, and for 5,000 to 7,000 workers to all walk off the fields at the same time, absolute discipline, absolute militancy. And that's the same kind of discipline and militancy that you're going to see in Delano almost 20 years later. And these are some of the workers in the FALA, the Filipino Agricultural Laborers Association. And again, Larry Ilion was a member of this union. And they went on to do some more organizing, but they were crushed during World War II. And I won't go into detail, you can ask me later. And you can also buy the book. Now, right after World War II, many of these men who had both been in the FALA and in the Alaskan Cannery Workers Union decided to start organizing workers again in the asparagus. And this is a gathering of some of the most important Filipino-American labor leaders that our community has ever seen. In this picture, you have Ernesto Mabalon, Crispin Salvas, Carlos Bolosan, Clara Candelario, and they were meeting to plan a strike in 1948 in Stockton because of terrible conditions, low pay, and various other issues. Again, the Central Valley was witness to one of the biggest strikes ever in American history, where 5,000, mostly Filipino, workers walk off the asparagus fields in May 1948. That strike is crushed by the growers. And the growers do the same thing that they do to the grape workers here. They kick them out of the fields. And they kick them out of their camps. In 1949, they're able to win some concessions. This union, however, is crushed because of red baiting. Many of the leaders of this union, Ernesto Magawan, Crispin Salvas, were accused of being communists. Many of them were communists. Some of the most militant and disciplined organizers were communists. However, what this meant, and Dr. Estela Cabal talked about this in her talk, it meant that many of the most powerful and militant Filipino labor leaders had to go underground and fight deportations and get caught up in court cases and not organize throughout the 1950s. Basically, Local 7 had to stop organizing farm workers. This was the building in Stockton's Little Manila that was headquarters of the 1948 strike. So we welcome you to come to Stockton and see some of this history. And so this is a flyer about the deportations and the red baiting that was happening, that was crushing Filipino labor organizing. And so you might be wondering, all of the strike activity, why does it grind to a halt in the 1950s? It's red baiting, it's McCarthyism. Many people have to go underground and stop organizing. However, Larry Ilion continues to work as a contractor, and by the late 1950s, there's some hope, and Gilbert Padilla talked about this, the organization of the Spanish mission band priests in Stockton starting to work with many of the farm workers, and they started to pressure the AFL-CIO. Now, Ernesto Mamawan was probably one of the most militant labor leaders that was driven underground, and he stopped organizing by the 1950s. So, okay. And this is Larry Ilion running for dispatcher and won this election in 1957 in Local 7, which became Local 37. because it got kicked out of the CIO because of the communist leadership. All right, which takes us to Stockton. All roads lead back to Stockton. So you have priests, you have community activists like Dolores Huerta, and you have this man, Cipriano Delvo, who was a contractor who had been kicked out of his camp in the 1940 asparagus strike, and he was also a Alaskan salmon cannery worker, who was also a Leonario's member. The AFL-CIO decided to start organizing farm workers and to create a union called the AWOC, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. The first Filipino organizer that they hired was this man, Cipriano Delvo. Now, Rudy Delvo had been organizing, remember, with Larry Young since the 1930s. They asked him, who else do you think could organize? Sorry, can you guys hear me? Rudy Delvo and his son, Dylan Delvo, is right here. So a lot of these children are here. He went to Larry Young and he said, this is it. This is our last stand. This is the best thing that could possibly happen to us, the AFL-CIO supporting farm workers. And so he asked Larry Young to join the staff of AWOC. Larry Young was hired pretty much immediately in 1960. Another organizer hired by AWOC in the early years was Chris Salvas. He had left Seattle and he worked for AWOC for a couple of years. Now Larry, he was so seasoned, so tough, so militant, he knew what he was doing. He was sent almost immediately down to Delano to organize into Coachella. Now in May 1965, the AWOC walks off the fields in Coachella because the farmers were paying them $1.10 an hour. Now, after a few days, the growers capitulate, but the growers refuse to give them a contract, and they make a deal. So many of the members of AWOC had been jailed because of the strike activity that the growers say, if you don't make us sign a contract with AWOC, we'll drop the charges and everybody will be able to get out of jail. That happens, except for the crew of Marcelo Tamsi. Any family members of the Tamsis here? You remember that family? In the Coachella area. Well, the workers refused to go back because Marcelo Tamsi's workers refused to go back because of a wage dispute. And so they held out. Those workers got brought back in, given the wage, and then brought back in. And then they came to work in Delano. They followed the grapes to Delano. And then they found that the farmers would not budge when they demanded the same wage, $1.40 an hour and 25 cents a box that the growers had given them in Coachella. And so at that moment on September 7th, you have to wonder how much of history they're thinking about when they're about to take this strike vote. They know what they're doing. In hindsight, again, we think of, in 2020, we think, well, this is a vote that's going to change the world, and it does. But for these Filipinos, this is a vote that they had been taking for decades, to stand up for themselves and to demand what was humane and what was just. And so we salute all of them, and we think about all of that bravery, all of that courage, all of that sacrifice. Viva la huelga, mabuhay ang causa. Thank you.